Meth gave me a lot of energy. It gave me excitement for life.
I was immediately attracted to it. Meth made me happier, meth made me more focused. You know, it just extended my partying for several more hours.
It just took sex to a whole nother level. Like, there were no inhibitions.
I put 200% into everything I did, whether it be homework, writing, cleaning, conversations.
In my hometown, it's a readily available drug. I mean, I know 10, 20, 30 different places where I could go get meth at any time, and I'd never experienced that with any other drug.
The first time I tried meth, I finally felt normal. I felt like I belonged. I felt better looking. I felt stronger. I felt more charming. I felt articulate. And how was I going to be able to be that way without meth?
The traditional way of looking at addiction has historically been to see it as a moral failing, that people use drugs because they're bad or crazy or they're willful or they want to use drugs. But what we're seeing from the research more and more is that addiction actually causes very pronounced brain chemistry changes in people, and that while people may start using a drug because it's working for them in some way, the big question remains, why can't they just stop when things start to go south on them in terms of the drug, when things start to go bad and the drugs are now causing serious consequences in their lives?
In the beginning, it was on the weekends, and I'd stay up the whole weekend, and it was definitely a more social party weekend thing. I didn't really see it happening, but soon the Monday morning would roll around, and I would be tired from partying, so I'd have to do more Monday morning to get me through my first day of work. And slowly it just crept up to where I was using basically daily.
I was using on the hour, on the half hour. Most of my free time was spent either using it or figuring out where I was going to get it next.
And once I was able to get it, I mean, I was spending all of my money on it. You know, I didn't have much money because I was in college, but I'd rather stay up for days and eat, rice cakes and peanut butter.
You know, when you talk about before it was a problem, well, there's no before it was a problem. Like, I did it the first time, and for the next 3 months, I didn't not do it. There was no lead in. Like, it was all of a sudden.
We know that a certain percentage can't stop. And the reason for this is that addiction is a brain disease. And when I say it's a brain disease or a disease of the brain, I'm not speaking in a metaphorical sense. The research and the evidence and the data shows us now that it's literally a disease.
Researchers studying the science of addiction focus on two key parts of the brain that influence our behavior: the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. The prefrontal cortex can be thought of as our brain's computer.
This is where we make our logical, rational decisions. It's our executive functioning part of the brain. It's what helps us decide to go to work instead of going to play, because we know we have to go to work and make money to pay our bills.
Just below the cortex lies the limbic system, an area of the lower brain that influences our more primitive and instinctual behavior. It is also known as the reward center.
The limbic system is very powerful. It does not direct our behavior like the cortex does. The cortex is the driver of our behavior. But the limbic system does reward us for species survival behavior. And the way it does this is by releasing neurotransmitters, brain chemicals like dopamine and serotonin and others, when we do something that helps us stay alive. And for example, it's where our sex drive comes from. It's because all animals are supposed to have sex to make more of their kind. When you eat a meal, that good feeling you get is the limbic system releasing some of these chemicals so that you will want to eat meals in the future when you're hungry. One of the things that we know about stimulants is that stimulants like cocaine and like methamphetamine especially cause the brain to release very large amounts of these neurotransmitters, dopamine to be more specific.
With continued use, the effects of stimulation from meth are so powerful they begin to change the brain's chemical makeup, reprogramming the limbic system to function in new and potentially dangerous ways. An experiment conducted on mice using cocaine proves how changes in brain chemistry directly impact our behavior.
If you take a mouse out of the cage and it can only voluntarily go into two areas, one area is brightly lit, the other one is dark, it will automatically go into the dark every time. It does this instinctively because mice and other small animals and rodents have been programmed by millions of years of species survival evolution to go into the dark to avoid predation. Now, if you take this mouse out and you force it into the lit area and you give it some cocaine, a powerful stimulant like cocaine, which is very similar in some ways to methamphetamine, in a very short period of time, if you let it out voluntarily, it will go into the light. So the mouse is literally putting its life at stake to get the drug. So we see that these drugs are so powerful that they can undo deeply ingrained species survival instinctive behavior. This gives a rationale for why some people continue to use in horrific circumstances where they literally put their lives and the lives of their families at risk, where they'll spend all the money for rent or for food on the drug or engage in very dangerous behaviors for the drug. And this is the very behavior that mystifies our communities, law enforcement, families, and the people themselves, because they will often present for treatment and say, I can't understand. I can't understand how I can do such crazy stuff. It makes no sense even to me. I must be a very bad person, or I must be crazy. But really, it's an issue of changed brain chemistry at this point. So as you move through the stages of addiction, what happens is that over time, the positive effects that you initially got from the drug decrease and the negative effects increase, and until the scales ultimately are tipped completely in the other direction.
I felt like I needed meth to do anything, to get out of bed, to go to the store, to do a load of laundry. I was dependent on meth to give me the motivation to do anything that life had to offer.
It got to the point where I only wanted to have sex if I was high on meth. It just became, that's all I wanted to do was, go on the internet, look for sex. But also the thing about it is since it takes away inhibitions, I found myself in getting in riskier and riskier situations, like, sleeping with people that, I were total strangers and not really caring.
At this stage, addicts can't stop because their brains have been conditioned by chronic use of meth. A well-known example of brain conditioning was made famous by Dr. Ivan Pavlov and his dogs. Each time he brought food to the dogs, he would ring a bell. The dogs would see and smell the food and then produce saliva and gastric fluid in anticipation of eating.
This response was triggered by their lower brains. Over time, Dr. Pavlov rang the bell and didn't bring any food into the lab, and the dogs all still produced saliva and gastric fluid. So the bell became a trigger for the anticipation for eating. Now, no matter how smart those dogs are or how well trained, when you ring the bell at this point, you can't say, when I ring this bell, I don't want you to drool. The dog can't help it. Well, the same thing happens in people, not only with food, but with certainly with drugs and certainly with meth. Like the bell is a trigger for the dogs wanting to eat, the triggers for people are people, places, and things historically associated with their use of methamphetamine. So that if they're around those people or in those places or around those things, that paraphernalia or whatever, their brain will literally release some dopamine, drool some dopamine, if you will, in anticipation of using the drug. So they are literally getting a little mini high just by thinking about copying the drug, going to buy the drug, or using the drug.
The anticipation I would get when I would have a bag in my pocket, I would have just this, it was almost like I was in the process of getting high. My body started to feel energized. I became extremely excited.
I couldn't wait to get home to use the drugs if I were to get them. The excitement and the high of that was probably almost more intense than the high itself.
If I didn't have any crystal meth around, a call would come from my dealer that he would either be coming over, or I could go over to that person's house and get some more crystal meth. And I would go from suddenly being exhausted because I hadn't had any for a day or two to having that instant energy.
Over time, with repeated chronic use, remember those psychological effects that were all positive, they all flip on you. So as before where you were more social, now you're isolating. Now you're starting to hallucinate and have other strong psychiatric consequences. One of my clients would report that when he walked down the street, if an airplane was overhead, he was convinced that the airplane was tracking him. Out of all the people in the city, it just had its beam on him.
I would get very paranoid. I would think I heard people outside of the building, outside of my home. I would see things out of the corner of my eye. Listening to the radio, I would think the radio announcers were speaking directly to me. I got very isolated. I was afraid of everyone. I didn't trust anyone. I thought everybody was out to get me or somehow trying to make me crazy by the things they were saying. So the only way I could have any peace of mind at that point would to isolate myself and stay away from everyone because I thought they were all out to get me.
For me, I just reached a point where I started to almost cross this line that I didn't think I would cross. I got pretty crazy. I started spray painting my whole place red. You know, everything had to be red. I was obsessed with the color red. It just brought me to this dark place, and that was no longer fun because I would spend my time isolated. I didn't even want any people around me.
I was in my bathroom, smoking meth in my bathroom by myself, and my daughter was crying and banging on the door to my bathroom, and I just couldn't stop. I just couldn't get out of the bathroom to go help her for 5 seconds.
This relationship with the drug with crystal meth started out as a love affair, and now it was kind of like a bad marriage, and I felt trapped. I didn't know how to leave this relationship. There were all these grand plans of ways to try and kick the drug, which I did try. I tried not using. I tried only being able to use twice a day. I tried using all other drugs that were more downers versus uppers to try and just get me through that period, and I just couldn't do it.
Of course, I would break my own rules that I made for myself as far as often as I used. If someone came over on let's say in the middle of the week when I wasn't supposed to use and had some, there was no way I could say no. And I thought that maybe if I just didn't use, if I just stopped using for a month or two, that I could go back and use and get high again and enjoy myself like I did at the beginning.
I'd wake up on a day-to-day basis not wanting to get high, but knowing that I would. It was just like, I just don't want to have to be anymore because I have to get high, and I don't want to anymore. Like, I don't want to do this.
My depression was so severe. I felt that my only option was suicide, and I was planning on suicide. A family member approached me and said that whatever I do, please don't try to kill myself. And at that point, I thought that I would try sobriety since I'd never tried sobriety before. That seemed like my only other option, suicide or sobriety.
When addicts begin the process of recovery from meth, their first challenge is to endure a period of withdrawal.
So what's happening in a withdrawal is that your own natural system in the body went off when you were using the drug, and now you've stopped using the drug, so now you don't have the real stuff going on, and you don't have the artificial stuff coming in, and that results in a profound physical and psychological depression.
Especially the first 2 weeks without having meth, it was involved mainly a lot of sleeping, and just even get outside was quite a feat. To get up and take a shower was a pretty significant accomplishment.
My first probably 20 days of treatment, all that I could think about every single day was putting drugs in the spoon. I really just wanted to be a different guy right away, and I was still completely obsessed with using.
After withdrawal, people in recovery may experience a phase of extremely positive feelings and emotions, sensations that have been non-existent for some time.
It's almost as if something in the body kicks in and there's a message like, hey, let's turn on those chemical factories. Let's make some good stuff. And this is what In the 12-step programs, they call the pink cloud, and we sometimes call the honeymoon stage, and you're kind of on a natural high. And this feels really good, and it's okay, but one has to be careful because during this stage, many people will convince themselves that maybe they weren't really addicted or it wasn't that bad, or they'll start to do other things like, prioritize their job first or school first instead of their recovery.
Oh yeah, there was a pink cloud period where I was calling everyone and telling them that I had cleaned up, and I was so gung-ho recovery, and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, and I was just, all excited. Life really hadn't settled in yet.
When the prospect of a sober life does set in, it can be overwhelming for people in early recovery.
My vision of what sober life was old men in meetings smoking and talking about their problems from 25 years ago. My preconceived notion of methamphetamine addicts recovering was that they don't. Everyone I hung out with, all my friends, had been to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 primary treatments. Everyone I know who goes to treatment doesn't make it.
I had concerns. I thought, okay, what is sex going to be like? It was so intertwined with my addiction that I thought, sober sex, what's this going to be like?
Would I be able to perform? Would I be interested in having it? What would it, would it feel the same? Or would I be able to find people who weren't using that I was interested in having sex with?
Gaining the weight was probably one of the only downsides to being sober. It was the one thing that I enjoyed about my meth use towards the end was that I was thin, so it was hard to accept the fact that I was going to gain some weight, and that's probably how I was going to stay.
I didn't think recovery happened, so I thought that my thinking was that in giving up use of crystal meth, that I would lose pretty much any sort of fun in my life. And that's the funny part, I wasn't having any fun.
One of the things that I'm struck by is this, in many communities, is this kind of pervasive sense that there is no recovery from meth, that the recovery rates are at 1 or 2% or less. And I would like to emphatically assure all of you that what I know from the research and talking to many of the researchers and clinicians, that this is absolutely untrue, that people recover from meth abuse and dependence at the same rates as they do from all other drugs and alcohol.
Embarking on a life without meth starts with some fundamental changes.
Well, when I came into treatment, I was willing to do whatever I was told. And so I listened to what was suggested, and they suggested I go to a sober house to keep my new sober life, going to add some structure, to build relationships with other sober people, to go to meetings, kind of to start my new life. I was told to put as much time into my recovery as I did with my use. So all my time, all my free time was spent in some aspect of recovery, whether it be fellowship with other sober people, going to 12-step meetings, meeting with a sponsor, reading books on recovery, meditation, prayer.
I supported myself with sober people. I no longer hung out with my using friends. And I actually started to see what those friendships were all about that I thought were like so special. They were really pretty lame.
I took up exercise as a regular part of my recovery routine, really, and I incorporated both weight training and running, and it has become a kind of a cornerstone in my recovery. When they talk about mind, body, and spirit, it is truly that.
There are many tools to help people in recovery through the daily challenges of a sober life.
Of course, everybody has bad days, and the first things an addict wants to do when they have a bad day is use. I learned to use the tools I was given in treatment and in sobriety so that I would not go use. Some of those tools were talking to other sober people, talking about what's going on with me. I'm talking to my sponsor. I'm involving myself in service work, kind of getting out of myself instead of soaking in my misery.
There was a time in my recovery where I had stopped